be upon you and welcome to Way Stations. My name is Rehan Khan, your co-host for today's show. Now, today is the 21st episode of Way Stations, and over the past few months, many of you have been getting in touch with us to say how much you've been enjoying the show. So we'd like to open up some of the topics to yourselves, our listeners as well. And if there's a topic that you would like us to explore, then please do send us an email on waystations@gmail.com. That's waystations@gmail.com. And we'll put the email address in the show notes. We can't promise that we'll be able to do the topic that you're suggesting, but we will definitely review it and we'll definitely do our best. And what we would say is that maybe just try and ensure that the topic is something related to the overall theme of the podcast, which is all about, what it means to be human in the modern age as well. Great. So today we will be discussing exploring without borders, which sounds like a very vast subject. And I'm very pleased that I'm joined, as always, by my regular co-host, Dr. Walead Mosaad. How are you doing, Dr. Walead?
I'm doing great, Rehan. How are you?
I'm very well. I remember when you suggested this topic to me, I was like, whoa, what is this? But I think we have quite an interesting show today.
No, I think so too. This kind of, as I mentioned, hits close to home, and I consider myself a bit of a traveler here and there, living in many different places throughout my life. So I think it'll be interesting.
Yeah, no, great. So today, so this concept of exploring the earth without borders, exploring without borders, it feels a little bit disjointed in the modern age because we live in an era of passports and biometric checkpoints and sometimes razor wire borders as well. Yet for much of kind of Earth's history, humans were able to just walk, ride, or sail across the earth, moving very freely from civilization to really just to witness culture and diversity. And in the classical world, scholars and seekers who wanted to travel didn't often stay in one place. They were often, their entire lives, they were moving from, one place to the other place. So Dr. Willie, just to start initially by asking you, as I say, in the modern world, travel, when we think about travel, we often look at travel through the lens of tourism, almost like a curated, commercialized escape. Oh, I went there, I did this, I ticked that off my bucket list. But in the classical world, travel was often a sacred concept. Often it was a search for knowledge. In the Muslim world, there was this concept of Rihla, which often, produced very legendary figures across the Muslim world who traveled as well. So how did that kind of classical tradition view, travel? And what did it mean not to travel just to escape yourself, but actually travel to perhaps educate yourself and to travel to transform the soul?
Yeah, I think, that's you hit on something important. I mean, as you mentioned, travel today is more curated. I hit the bucket list, and invariably you wind up at the tourist sites, sometimes referred to as tourist traps. Also, because you have, a very eager band of locals waiting for you to, separate you from your money. But I think if we look at I'm not going to say the ancient world, but let's say the pre-modern world, I think travel meant something very different to them. And like you said, there was a sanctity or a sacredness about it. And they did not, I think, undertake it as, let's say, casually as we do. In the sense, okay, let's go to, Rome today, or next week, let's plan to go to Bali. And and these are kind of, for someone who's living far away from these places, far off, exotic places. And, someone in the ancient world, pre-modern world, would not be thinking about heading out that far as that's going to be my final destination and I'm going that way. I think there was more of an informality to it. And, when they set out, they didn't know what they were going to encounter. Right? You didn't have, access to travel logs and infrastructure on the internet to tell you what to expect, and guides and ratings of restaurants that are, nowadays people kind of have all that set out before they head out. So, and I think the sanctity about it has a lot to do with the idea of what we call, or what's called in the Quran, of i'tibar. And you have several verses in the Quran that actually say this, siru fil ard. siru, travel in the land. Basically, that's what that means. And then for various reasons, one of the verses that I'll quote here says, "Siru فانظروا كيف بدأ الخلق." Look, travel in the land and see how God originated the creation. So that tells me that it's something that's shaping your psyche, your soul, your heart, not just kind of a foray out there and get some sort of exotic experience or drink or food or something you didn't experience at home. And and then other verses also similar. فانظروا كيف كان عاقبة المجرمين أو المكذبين, and see what was the fate of those, of the deniers, or of those who did wrong to others, and things like this. So the idea of shaping you as a human being. And why does travel have this particular trait of shaping people? Because if it's devotional, not recreational, there's an inherent, I would call it, reorienting of the self. And the reason for that, because there's a tension in travel, even modern travel today. Like, you're out of your comfort zone. You're doing something that is not your everyday, and invariably you're going to encounter things that may grate against you and grate against your comfort zones, right? You have people who have what they call agoraphobia. Like, they don't want to head out. That's like to an extreme that they just don't want to leave that comfort zone of theirs. So imagine if you're going to somewhere where maybe you don't speak the language, and different currency, and different religion, and different ethnic backgrounds you're encountering. So all of that is going to create tension, because you're in the unknown, the unfamiliar. And the small self with the lowercase s, or the ego, craves familiarity and comfort and ease and facilitation, and not things where there might be an inherent tension. So getting you out of that comfort zone is part of it. And we take it for granted now, but really, you talk about seeking knowledge. When people want to seek knowledge, if you read the manuals of the Muslim sages, they'll say, exhaust the circles of knowledge or the people of knowledge in whatever your locale you're on, then move on. So it was kind of known, like, okay, in this particular city, let's say I'm in Khorasan or Bukhara, or hadith masters, for example, people who were masters of the prophetic traditions. But then if you're looking for something else, let's say you wanted jurisprudence to a particular school of thought, let's say you wanted to study the Maliki school, you would not find that in that area. You would not find people who know. You'd have to probably travel quite a distance, probably at least 1,000 kilometers or two, to the west, before you hit something like Egypt or North Africa, where you would find, that sort of thing that you're looking for. So this idea then of traveling for seeking knowledge. And in the very early period, when the hadith tradition was kind of being consolidated, they traveled long distances, and maybe many months, maybe for a singular prophetic tradition. And there's a very famous story of one of the great hadith scholars of Imam al-Bukhari, I believe, that he traveled this long distance to get one single hadith narration, prophetic narration. And then he gets there, and he saw that the man that he was supposed to speak to had like a carrot, and he was kind of enticing his mule and then putting it behind his back. And then, he said, then he left. And then his companion said, you traveled all this way, and you didn't even talk to him. He said, someone who's deceiving their mule like that, how can I trust them with the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad? So, they did this very long, arduous journeys. And also back then, for them travel, they didn't know when they're coming back or if they're coming back. Very famously, obviously, everybody knows about Ibn Battuta, who went like a couple decades or three. And, he kind of just lived his life on the road, basically from North Africa all the way to, the East, into China almost. So that's kind of another version of that story. So I think, we're thinking about travel, if we think of it in a sacred or devotional sense, it'll be to shape you into some, to transform you. So not just like you're the star of the story and you go to this locale. I've done Monaco, and I've done Santorini, and I've done this, and people, like you said, put on their bucket list, rather than, oh, I met these people in this particular place and I was transformed. And even nowadays, what I've noticed when I travel is, if you're kind of plugged into the, whatever 5-star or 4-star, whatever level of luxury infrastructure that you're on, the Intercontinental Hotel in Muscat, Oman is really no different than the Intercontinental in Denver, Colorado, for all intents and purposes. So if you're just kind of plugged into that thing, you're not seeing anything different, right? You're not meeting the people, the people who make that place. So number one, it's more people oriented than it is I am seeing the sights. Now we're like seeing the sights, whatever that means, instead of rather visiting and meeting people and getting insight into what those people, how they live, and so forth. So I think it's quite different, and I think, but however, it's not lost, and you could still do that today. And invariably, you find these people who do these programs. The late Anthony Bourdain, I think, and others who actually traveled and that's what they did. They met people. It wasn't so much just about the place and the buildings, but the experience that they acquired while on their travels. So, but let's say from your perspective, you have these very intricate, and I know you do a lot of research before you kind of set the scene for whatever historical fiction that you're writing, and very intricate details about places and things and people and so forth. And then if it's a storytelling narrative and maybe there's a hero's journey, and that requires crossing a physical world, especially in the pre-modern world, you cross like the inhabited physical part, and then you go into the wild. So in an age where every square inch of our planet, the satellites can see it and it's mapped out by that, how do you use the fiction to revive that kind of raw ancestral feeling of the endless horizon? And what does this teach us about the human potential?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I'd just like to come back on one thing that you said. Certainly, obviously people sometimes travel and they go to places and stay in places which are unique and very different. And that's really great because you get that sense. And sometimes people travel and they want to stay in a hotel where they kind of like know what they're going to get. And that's also okay as well, if people want to do that. Like I said, I know what I'm going to get if I go to the Intercontinental, or you mentioned Denver or wherever, and you went somewhere else. And that's also fine if you want to do that. But obviously, then you shouldn't get, that shouldn't prevent you from, experiencing that local flavor. And I think that's the danger, I guess. That's the issue. And even in the classical world, there were places like the caravanserais, so along the Silk Roads, and you knew if you went to a caravanserai, yes, it wasn't called the Intercontinental, but if you went to a caravanserai, you knew what you were going to get because it was a caravanserai and there was a standard all the way from Bukhara to West Africa. You knew kind of what you were going to get. But certainly we shouldn't ignore the fact that there's that we get transformed on those local journeys. To answer your question, then. As you say, today, I think, a lot of the world is very much photographed and digitized and geofenced and so on. And so you kind of lose that, almost that magic of exploration. And certainly historic fiction covers that. I'd like to mention maybe fantasy novels. There's one here I've got actually, the Earthsea Quartet by Ursula Le Guin. And it's a high fantasy novel. Millions of people have read it. And it really describes a world where there isn't a continent and it's not divided by political borders, but it's an endless ocean. And so this whole planet, the Wizard of Earthsea, there's basically just endless ocean, and there's these archipelagos of islands which are kind of all together, and many of them are unmapped, and the ocean just seems to go on and on and on. And the protagonist, Ged, he sets out on his small boat, and he kind of navigates through this kind of borderless world, no passports, no customs agents, no national entities controlling particular waterways. And so when you travel in this fantasy world in Earthsea, you're essentially moving at the mercy of the elements, at the mercy of the wind, right? You're encountering all these different cultures and all these islands. Some have sorcerers, some have communities, some have raft dwellers who spend all their entire time just at sea. And there's all these kind of forgotten languages that the character encounters. And I think what she's really talking about in the story is just that sense of unbounded geography. For the reader to really experience kind of travel in a much more transformative way, which is what the main character goes through. The travel is very transformative. And it's not about the travel in this particular book. It's not about conquering, got to conquer this land or conquer this space. And it's not about consumption. I've got to go there and consume this. It's really about character development. And so I think historic fiction and also fantasy can do that quite well, where through the arc of that hero's journey, you can see how travel transforms you. So it's the experience of it rather than I'm going there to, conquer something and so on. So for sure, I think fiction writers and fantasy writers have done that. Now, just coming back to your self-doctor, Willie, if I can ask you, I think, today in modern nation states, which obviously are the norm in the 20th century, and, before that, there weren't such strict borders and visas and, legal classification and so on. And of course, that's fine. That's how the modern world is. And we're not, criticizing that. But in the classical world, the concepts of, a jurisdiction and human movement, they were framed very differently because it wasn't, necessarily visas and, legal classification. Could you just maybe share with us how classical jurisprudence kind of viewed the world in a world when before borders, before perhaps law and order to protect the traveler, and I say law and order to protect the traveler in inverted commas, was there kind of a universal sense of safety that people could just, travel, or was there always imminent danger at just around the corner?
Yeah, that's a good question. What my reading from what the jurisprudence talked about in terms of travel is that they did view it with, I think, some level of caution. And the reason for this, we just mentioned everything is geo-tracked and satellites and so forth. And, now we have mega cities, the city of London, for example. I mean, how from one end to the next, or New York City, or the five boroughs, or Cairo, for that example, or Delhi. We're talking millions and millions of people. And what would have been in the pre-modern world, dozens of towns at least, if not more, and separated by vast swaths of hinterland or wilderness, and not connected. So that was their, let's say, their conception, their tasawwur. So the fuqaha, the jurisprudence, say whenever you want to issue a ruling for something, you have to understand what's the concept, what's the framework you're working with. So that's the framework that they were working with, and so there was caution attached with that, because you might be safe within the town, the confines of the town, right? I don't think people were really worried that some random person is going to come and harm you, like maybe what we have today. But that wasn't, I think, a big fear. But the more of the fear was in between the towns. When you set out, whether it be the desert or the forest or whatever, or even more so the ocean, to the degree that some of them, even though they had shipping and they had boats that could sail, but the jurisprudence of Morocco, for example, for a time told people not to go in the ocean. So, and there were wars on the land between them and Mecca. So they tell people that they don't have to go to Hajj because the trip is too arduous and too dangerous. So they took those sort of things in consideration. And then when they talked about travel, especially for women, and this is where people hear about that particular ruling that women shouldn't travel alone and they should have a companion or a mahram. It was for that reason, for the safety reason, and that's why that fatwa has been kind of updated according to most of the ulama. If a woman is on an airplane, she goes to the airport, there's hundreds of people there. She gets on an airplane, there's hundreds of people in the airplane. She gets off to destination airport, there's hundreds of people there. It's not like traveling in the wilderness by yourself. Maybe nowadays the closest thing would be if you're going on long stretches of motorway at night, where there's kind of very few people. That might be comparable, right? But outside of this, I think it's much, much different in our age today. So they approached it with caution, and they would also talk about the reason you're traveling. Why are you traveling? Are you going to Hajj? Are you going to Umrah? Are you seeking knowledge? Are you, the idea of tourism like we have it today wasn't really a thing, wasn't a concept. But interesting enough, the word that's used in the Quran, in the literature, is siyaha, which is the same word as tourism. But siyaha for them meant like wayfaring, wandering, right? So someone could be a wanderer or a wayfarer, and like I mentioned earlier, as a transformative spiritual experience, not as I'm trying to do the roulette wheel at Vegas or whatever it is that people travel for. So that, I think that's one kind of big or stark difference. But at the same time, you mentioned it just now, that there were these kind of a different type of traveler infrastructure that existed. And at least in the Muslim world, you could arguably say that it was pretty easy or relatively easy to go from one Muslim land to the next, like Ibn Battuta did, and Ibn Jubayr, and it's actually a genre in Islamic literature, the Rihla, that there's so many of them that did that they, it comes under a genre in of itself. And what you find is common between all of them is that they were relatively easily they can go from North Africa to sub-Saharan Africa to Egypt, to the Arabian Peninsula, to Khorasan, which would be the stands now today, and after Iraq, and they did that pretty easily because the culture was common. And then they have obviously the travel infrastructure, as you mentioned. They had khans and ribats and the caravanserai. If you recall, when we had a podcast about it, the Hijra Walk, we actually were introduced to the origin of the word milestone, when there's actually a stone that about every mile, which is where that comes from. The mil is actually an Arabic origin, as you know. So about every mile or so, there were these stones that we actually saw on the route from Mecca to Al-Medina. So that infrastructure was there. And the idea of the traveler was something, I think, also sacred. And you find in Islamic literature, whoever believes in Allah and the last day, then they will honor their guest. So this idea of honoring the guest, that served more as like the passport than the actual passport and visa and things like this, that the person was a stranger coming in as a guest and so forth. But, it wasn't always safe. The very famous story of Salman al-Farisi, one of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, who was searching for the truth, who was searching for knowledge. And he left Persia. He was a prince there, literally the prince of Persia, very wealthy, had a very cushy, easy life, but he wanted to know more. So he traveled to Jerusalem, he traveled to Palestine, and studied with monk after monk after monk. When they would pass away, another would come. And they said that what you're looking for, the prophet of the last days, you'll find in the land of the palm trees, of the date palm trees. So he entered the Arabian Peninsula, and almost immediately he was captured and enslaved because he didn't have a patron. He didn't have someone that would give him what's called jiwar or aman. So jiwar and aman, which even existed in pre-Islamic Arabia, is someone vouches for you. And the interesting thing about that concept is it didn't have to be the tribal chief or the leader. Anyone could do that. So even in their society, a woman could do that. So, you can't hurt him. I gave him jiwar. I gave him aman. I gave him safe passage. So no one could do anything. And then they respected that. Unfortunately for Sayyidina Salman, he didn't encounter that right away. But as you know, eventually his freedom was bought and he became one of the closest companions of the Prophet Muhammad, to the degree that he said, he's from my household, the statement that the Prophet made about him. They did have this sort of infrastructure. And I think in many ways you can argue and say that travel was somewhat easier from that perspective, that you will find people to take you in. We know that one of the recipients of the zakah or the charity tax in Islam is Abd Sabil or Ibn Sabil, which is the person who's traveling and doesn't have access to funds. And if they're in their particular, then that person can actually be a recipient of the zakah. So that's how much they put the important significance on a traveler and treating them kindly and fairly and getting them home if they need to get home and even giving them funds to do so and things like this. So from that perspective, I think, that was quite there. Whether that situation was actually the same in Europe at the same time, I'm not a historian of the period, but I doubt it, that it would be like that, especially for a Muslim traveler to travel up north. Maybe that was somewhat unique to the Muslim lands. Included in those Muslim lands was the Silk Road and passing through. And I think you've written in eras that take place during the time of the Silk Road, and you depict spaces where cultures, language, and faiths mingle with kind of a fluidity. But today we often look at the past through these borders, right? We can, this is England and this is Scotland, and but how do you use historical storytelling to remind modern listeners that our ancestors were often far more cosmopolitan, open, and borderless in their thinking than we are today?
Yeah, no, yeah, thank you for that. I think, even I remember growing up and we would go back to India, where my parents are from, North India, for holidays and stuff. And, it was one of those big kind of ancestral type homes that you would call in the local tongue, you'd call like a haveli, like it's a big, big, big place. And you'd always have like some like traveler from a different part who was kind of distant related or the friend of a distant relative who would just turn up and then, unannounced completely because there weren't, people didn't send telegrams. There were telegrams, but people didn't necessarily send telegrams. And they would just turn up and it wasn't like, okay, so when's this person here till? It was like, okay, no, they turned up, we just have to make a room for them, give them food. And no one would really ask them like, when are you going? It's just like, well, they came like, and then we just have to be hospitable to them. Of course, there were some people who would take advantage of that situation as well. But on the whole, I think most people were quite respectful. But it was just a thing. Like if someone turned up, obviously you would just give them board, you'd give them food, and that was it. That was fine. And I think even the houses were set up in that way. There was always like a guest quarter on the perimeter of the house, where obviously any guest who turns up, they're looked after. I think in terms of then historic fiction, one book which I really enjoyed, I did read it a while ago. I've got it here with me, which is The Moors Account by Laila Lalami, and it really does explore this whole issue of a world without borders. And it's a fictionalized memoir of someone called Mustafa al-Zamouri, who is a Moroccan man who gets enslaved by the Spanish. Spanish then take him to I think it's Portugal, where then they baptize him and give him a Christian name of Estebanico. And he then, Mustafa is then taken to La Florida, like to the Americas in 1527. And it's actually based on a real Spanish expedition that took place to La Florida. And there, basically, he is, there was four people, I think, and he was the fourth, and the other three were Spanish. And what ends up happening is that they end up going on this journey really to over 8 years, walking across kind of a borderless, obviously Americas at the time, and all the way down to South America and down to Mexico City. And so when the story begins, the Spanish conquistadors turn up in the area of Florida, and they meet the local people, the Native Americans. And immediately the Spanish want to define the borders. They turn up and say, right, these are our borders. They arrive on the beach in Florida, and then they read an official Latin proclamation saying that the land, the people, and all the riches belong to the Spanish crown and God. And they used to do this, like literally turn up and read in Latin. And obviously none of the locals could understand, and they would smile and say, yes, whatever. And so they're essentially immediately trying to impose borders and legal, declarations on the local people. Now, what happens in the story is that the whole expedition falls apart due to disease, starvation, navigation errors, and the surviving Spaniards and Mustafa, they end up literally losing all their weapons, all their armor, and in order to survive, they have to walk thousands of miles across this unmapped territory entirely. And this is the interesting thing. They only survive because of the hospitality of the indigenous people. Right? Very interesting. Like what we were talking about, like, in the Muslim world, they only survive because of the hospitality of the indigenous people. And so, so you see this world where the Spanish want to introduce all these kind of, borders and this and that. Whereas the local people there and the Native Americans and also, Mustafa, they come from this very fluid kind of environment. So Mustafa and the Spanish, they then survive by learning the native languages. They end up adopting, indigenous customs. They end up wearing indigenous clothing. And eventually, Mustafa becomes a respected shaman and healer. And he goes from tribe to tribe, and becomes a healer. And he's not, he's welcomed very much as almost like as a local, rather than as a foreigner. So I think that book, as a historic fiction, really does explore the historical reality of what the Americas was like, where there weren't these kind of artificial boundaries, but there was that sense of exploration. But in order to be transformed, you had to approach it from a sense of humility, unlike what the Spanish originally did, where they were going to conquer. But that led to obviously destruction on their part. But actually, when they went with a sense of humility, you then that's the journey of transformation. So I think some historical books like that, the Moor's Account by Laila, Lalami, do that really well. Just shifting back to yourself, Dr. Walead, can I ask you, like in Sufism or in the Sufi tradition, physical travel is often seen as a direct mirror of an internal kind of spiritual journey. And there's that kind of concept of safar al-qalb, or the traveling of the heart towards the divine. And for many great mystics, and it's well documented, they traveled across open deserts, but they also traveled through crowded marketplaces. But they weren't distracted from seeking God, whatever environment they were in, and they were essentially witnessing God and his names, wherever they were. So how does that kind of encountering completely new civilizations, really help break the rigid kind of internal borders of our own ego and perhaps some of the prejudices that we have?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think we alluded to it earlier when we talked about kind of the transformational aspect of travel. To the degree that you find the sages using these terms, that's their dictionary. Suluk, salik, maqam, manazil, all of these are travel words that are metaphors that are then used for the travel of the human heart. And basically, when you have travel, then you have a destination. And what's that destination? In the Muslim tradition, it's God, it's Allah. Or in other traditions, will say similarly, like illumination or enlightenment, or openings and things like this. So it's really traveling the border of the confines of, let's say, the small self, or the egoistic aspect of our humanity, getting beyond that. And then if you get beyond the border of that, then that's where you find the open plain and felicity and green meadows. And so and they use that sort of language when they talk about it. And again, the impetus for that is getting out of your comfort zone, even meeting other people, seeing them as mirrors of yourself, right? The very famous prophetic tradition that your brother is a mirror of yourself. So you learn things about yourself by seeing them in others, and that's not going to happen if you're just at home doom scrolling, and or what they call it now, bed rotting, when you're just in the bed all day scrolling.
Brain rot.
So,
I think it's called brain rot, right?
Yeah, I think something like that.
Yeah.
And you're not getting out, and you're not seeing these things, and you're not being exposed to it. So I think people had a boldness that we're kind of lacking today, that they're willing to get out of that comfort zone, and in order to not necessarily to transform just right then and there, but to avail yourself of a possible change, transformation, to leave open the possibility that something like that will happen. And the famous prophetic tradition, Tuba lil ghuraba, glad tidings to the ghuraba, the strangers, or the ones who feel estranged, right? The ones who feel like this comfort zone everybody else is enjoying, I don't really feel comfortable with it. I want to do something else, right? And I think maybe other cultures would describe it as wanderlust, want to be somewhere different. And maybe that has a little bit of an egoistic impulse about it, because you always think the grass is greener somewhere else. But here, I think from their perspective, it's like, oh, you're going to leave and cross take the caravan and go out into the desert, and these highway marauders can come and just do anything to you. And those were the real world concerns. That's what they had. And they had to contend with such things, even during the Hajj, and very famously during the time of Saladin or Salahuddin, the Hajj caravan was attacked by Crusader troops, and they faced that. So they took it seriously, but at the same time they understood, I think, the importance of it. And many of the ulama, the scholars, they traveled to many different places, like Imam Shafi'i, who was born in what's nowadays is Gaza, Palestine, and went to Iraq, and then he came back. He went to Medina, studied with Imam Malik. Then he goes to Egypt. And in fact, it's said that his travel experience shaped the way he saw the world. And in the Shafi'i school, there's something called the old school and the new school, al-Madhhab al-Qadim and al-Madhhab al-Jadid. And the old school was his perspective when he was in Iraq, and then the new school his perspective when he was in Egypt. So somehow the Egyptians changed his perspective about how to look at certain issues, and as a result, the fatwa changed. For some particular things. Yeah. So that also is another aspect of it, that it opens you up and you see things and you have more experience. And rather than things become just merely theoretical, then they become more experiential. And that's why even the Sufi sages, they don't dismiss emotional reactions or emotions in general, because they see that as your travel mount. They actually call it that. This is Ibn Arabi calls it al-Matiyya. This is what you're traveling on, like it's your horse or your camel. It's taking you to where you need to go. So that fit of anger or that sadness or that trepidation, if channeled in the right way, will lead you to your destination and should not be seen as a distraction, but it actually part and parcel of the journey that's going to take you where you want to go. And obviously that needs shaping and that needs mentorship. And we've talked about that in previous podcasts, but that's the basic premise. To get out there and see and lead yourself to be a better version of yourself, a more knowledgeable one, a more compassionate one, a more merciful one, a more respectful one, because you've come into contact with all these different things that perhaps you encountered on your journey, not just your physical journey, but actually you'll encounter these milestones and these pit stops and these manazil on your spiritual journey. And they actually call these stopping places states, traits of the heart. So patience is one, gratitude is another, contentment is another. You go through them, and in actuality, they're all going to exist and subsist within you. But as you encounter them and you learn to channel them and see them for what they are, that they are your way to your final destination, then they become that much more potent and impactful when you do encounter them. So it's all, I think, very fascinating, quite interesting, the parallels between those two things. And, we talked about how people go through have these internal borders, but once you cross that border, then you find something else. But I wanted to talk a little bit about, I'm a fan of science fiction, as you know, and invariably when we get into science fiction, not maybe contemporary science fiction, and they go beyond borders, it goes to some sort of absolute limit or the infinite expanse of the cosmos, and films like Interstellar and others where like time and space have a whole different meaning and things like this. But a lot of that genre kind of defaults to like these dark dystopian tropes where space is carved out by mega corporations or militarized planetary empires, which is, I think, a lot of people, that's kind of a trope now. It's like, is there nothing other way we can think of the future? So as a sci-fi writer, how do you like construct a future that avoids these kind of cynical traps? How do we tell sci-fi stories where space exploration, expands human virtue, empathy, and not then heads to the default of this apathy and destruction and dystopia? Rather than just exporting our terrestrial borders here on Earth, and then we make the stars look like that too.
Yeah, exactly. That's definitely something that happens in a lot of science fiction. Certainly with the science fiction that I've written, as you know, Tales of Khayal, a lot of that is centered in traditional, metaphysics and alignment of the heart and those kind of things. So I think that's, I don't want to, use the podcast to trump my own books, but but I think that's something that people can certainly explore in their own way. What I will do, though, to answer your question, is perhaps give some examples which people will be familiar with. And I think one of the challenges, I think, for people who come from a faith tradition is that a lot of modern science fiction is quite godless. It doesn't actually have a space for a creator for the divine, which is problematic for people who, as they come from a faith tradition, because you don't feel entirely comfortable within that narrative. But having said that, let me just give perhaps two examples from modern day science fiction. One, of course, would be something like Gene Roddenberry's, Star Trek, which fundamental premise of Star Trek is this kind of united federation of planets that operate under a kind of a prime directive. And it envisions the future where, humans have completely outgrown that kind of sense of internal borders, obsession with nation states, hyper-capitalist greed. I don't think there's even money in Star Trek, I think, if I'm right. And so, the mission of the USS Enterprise isn't territorial expansion. It's not about mining resources. It's not about, policing the boundaries. It's explicitly to explore new worlds, to boldly go where, no one has gone before.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you have the soundtrack and the Starship Enterprise shoots off. Anyway, so when the members of the crew encounter a new alien civilization, there's no moral mandate to conquer, to assimilate. There are some antagonists who turn up in Star Trek Next Generation called the Borg Collective, and of course they want to. Resistance is futile, right? So they seek to assimilate.
Pesky Romulans and the Ferengi and
exactly, and the Klingons as well.
Klingons.
And to what extent some of those were Cold War tropes, it's difficult to know exactly, but possibly. But anyway. Fundamentally, it's not about conquering, but it's about observing and non-interference. And I think that's also within the Star Trek code of the Federation, is not to interfere, and especially where a planet doesn't have advanced technology, it's really not to interfere. So I think that's kind of one example of science fiction where maybe that sense of exploring, in a cosmos without borders, it's done quite well. But again, there's no necessarily. As people from a faith tradition perhaps struggle with the overall narrative arc of that, but okay, that's fine. The other example, again, which is maybe from a universe which, again, a science fiction writer, I don't think was writing from a faith tradition, and I don't think was someone of a faith tradition either, is a book called Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke. And I might be wrong about his faith. I might be completely wrong, but but anyway, and if anyone wants to correct me, they're very welcome to correct me on that. But Rendezvous with Rama, it's a science fiction novel, which starts, basically the story begins with like this massive, like 50-kilometer long, perfect cylinder enters the Earth's solar system. Now, it's not there to invade, right? It seems to be just like mapping the solar system or something. So a group of human explorers goes out to intercept this big, cylinder. And they step inside, and they go inside, and they find this entire like landmass inside this 50-kilometer cylinder. There are seas, there are continents that are operating on completely different scale. And this whole ship, there's no one on it, but it's full of advanced, intelligent life in terms of technology, and it's so far ahead of humans that actually, the humans are just stunned. And it's only come into our solar system because it actually plans to slingshot around the sun to continue its journey. So there the humans are trying to like take control of the ship, take all the technology and, do what they want to do. But the ship and the aliens sort of, who sent it there literally just sent it. So it just slingshots through and just goes on. And I think what Clarke's really writing about is the fact that sometimes we have a very small-minded kind of territorial way of thinking. When we see something, we say, we want to take it. It's ours. Whereas actually, as far as the aliens were concerned, the humans were just irrelevant. And it was just like, well, we're just passing through. And so that sense of wonder is lost when you want to acquire, when you want to hoard, rather than just actually traveling for a sense of wonder. So I think sci-fi definitely does that, I think, quite well. Some of the classic sci-fi stories. And of course, if there's any that the readers out there want to recommend, then please drop us an email. And if you want to correct me about Arthur C. Clarke's faith, then you can do that as well, because I might be completely wrong on that one. Anyway, so if I can ask you, Dr. Walead, when traditional travelers, they crossed lands and with different languages and customs and religious traditions, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have like 5-star guides and so on, but they had to rely on kind of a shared human ethic. And the Quran, states that humanity is made into nations and tribes so that you may know one another. So how were travelers expected to engage with, foreign civilizations with something that looked and felt very, very different? And what did that encounter? How was that encounter? How would they have encountered that? Would that be in from a sense of humility and adab, or would that in the traditional world would have been done more from conquest and superiority?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question, and um, I think there's kind of a civilizational rupture here because we're the inheritors of this idea that diversity perhaps is a source of tension and might breed contempt, and the idea that foreign cultures, when they came into contact with one another, necessarily then it would indicate a default state of war. And I'm not sure that that was always the case. I think certainly you had this did run throughout collective human history, but I think at the same time, at least from ethos of the Islamic tradition, the idea is that we were created diverse. The Quran says to know one another. We've been created into nations and tribes so that you may get to know one another, right? So that diversity is enriching. Then it's not meant to be a source of tension or for one to declare the superiority over another. And actually, that's a very satanic impulse to think that because you're different, you're better, and that was what Satan got him into trouble with God, with Adam, because he's from fire and he's from clay, and I'm better, so why should I have to capitulate or prostrate or so forth? And I think, nonetheless, you did find this invariably in even in the early companions of the Prophet Muhammad. One of the companions, Bilal ibn Rabah, was black and he was from sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the Arab companions said to him, "The son of the black woman," in a pejorative way and disparaging way. And the Prophet responded, told this Arab companion, "You still have some old ignorance in you, fika jahiliya. You still have some of the old ways. That's not how we talk to people, right?" So he had to kind of give him a scolding and a public one at that, and corrected him. Because that was just kind of completely unacceptable. So you did have this to some degree, and not to debate, the early Umayyad dynasty and the idea of, the Arabism that some encountered and the Abbasid revolution had happened. That's debatable history. But I think the general ethos of it is that, no, our diversity is supposed to be enriching. And when we come into contact with people of other cultures, then we should be accommodating and curious at the least, and then open to, to discussion and so forth. And I think you mentioned the other day or something, actually it's coming up with your book club, the book about Ibn Fadlan, right, who was a real figure, wasn't just some made up figure, but he traveled all the way to Scandinavia, and you found that not uncommon that happened. Another scholar, Al-Baqallani, who was a famous theologian, actually traveled to Europe, to the Byzantine Empire and Constantinople, and he was a guest there. And so you did have these kind of cross-cultural intellectual exchanges, and people tend to get along. And some of those old minted coins that they found all the way in Scandinavia that bear the mark of the Khalifa in the Abbasid one. And there's a lot of evidence that Arab Muslims made their way to the Americas before Columbus did. It's kind of almost a given now that certainly happened, and that they came into contact with the native tribes in America, or what was North America back at that point. And there wasn't an idea that we have to conquer them, or we have to steal from them, or we have to take things from them, and so forth. What was the impetus that caused the European powers at some point in their history to want to do that? I don't think I'm at liberty to say for certain what that is, but you did not have that same sort of, I think, strain within Muslim cultures. Certainly, they wanted to spread the faith and they wanted to propagate the faith, but at the at the choosing of the people who would choose or not choose, that was the idea. But not conquering and pillaging and conquest and things like this. And you don't find monuments like in Mecca or Medina erected to the so-called conquests, right? And in European history books will say that the Arabs conquered this place and that place, but if it truly was a conquest, where are the monuments to these conquests? And they didn't see it as a conquest. They saw that as openings and for people to come into the faith willingly. Did that always happen 100% all the time? Probably not. I mean, certainly, there's a a line of what the ideal is, and then reality comes into place. But here we're talking just about the strain or the ethos of the tradition itself. Yeah, back in response to your question, I think the idea was that people were supposed to be welcomed and taken in and with open arms, and this took a while for this to happen. And I think nowadays, I believe the reason that we have at least a broader level of acceptance than maybe we did, let's say, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, is because that ethos, I think, spread to different places and it came in. So I think that's one of the positive things about the time that we live in. It's more or less accepted that no, you're Danish or you're Norwegian or you're Flemish or you're a human being above and beyond all of that. So anyway, getting back to what we were talking about earlier with yourself. So you teach moral leadership, and we were talking about different cultures, and invariably you must come across people who are of different cultures and maybe have different ways of doing things and how they lead, especially across cultural divides. So when we read a story that authentically drops us in a completely foreign civilization, our cognitive borders shift. So we tend to kind of, okay, I'm in this place. This is acceptable here. I have to learn to accept that, and maybe not acceptable where I come from. So how does the act of reading then virtue-based stories about the other then train a leader's brain to operate without borders?
Yeah, good question on that one, I think. And before I come to that, I just wanted to pick up on one thing you said, which was about Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who was a 10th century diplomat from Baghdad who traveled with the Scandinavians north. And of course, he wrote a risala when he came back about his adventures with the mist monsters and the what happened up there. Famously, Michael Crichton, who obviously wrote Jurassic Park and wrote many other books, he wrote a book called Eaters of the Dead about which is a fictionalized tale of Ahmad ibn Fadlan. And there was a movie made in the 1990s starring Antonio Banderas, the 13th Warrior, which as part of the book club recently, I read the book, but I also watched the movie. And I've got to say, it was actually not bad. I think for some reason, I had a negative view of it. When I watched it again, actually, considering it's a Hollywood movie from 1999, you have a Muslim character who is praying, which doesn't happen. Okay, and it was not bad. It was not bad at all. But on a more serious note, and you say there, obviously there are loads of coins discovered, dinars discovered in Scandinavia. There's literally hundreds of thousands of dinar coins because the Vikings would bring down fur and honey from Scandinavia, and they would come down to Baghdad, and they would take back silver. They love dinars. So I think I believe I'm right. There's more written about the Vikings in the primary sources in Arabic than in any other language.
Interesting,
right? Because the Vikings didn't write themselves, right? So there's more written about the Vikings in the primary sources, i.e., at the time, in Arabic than in any other language. And again, the Vikings famously came down. Initially, they tried to conquer the Arabs, but then they came up against the armies of the Abbasid, who were extremely well organized, and they lost every battle. And so the Vikings put down their weapons and said, we can't beat these people, but let's trade with them. And then they begin this whole trade and it must have been quite a sight to be in Baghdad in the 10th century and see like a 6'4", blonde-haired, blue-eyed Scandinavian walking through the market selling fur and honey. And it must have been quite a sight. But anyway, getting back to your question. Yeah, I think one of the challenges for executives who work in a cross-cultural environment is how to dismantle those psychological borders that build up in all of our minds, which might be as a result of biases that we have, might be the result of cultural silos, and also our cultural kind of blind spots that we have. So there's something in cognitive psychology and neuroscience called the narrative transportation theory. The narrative transportation theory. And what it shows, it demonstrates that when a human brain reads a compelling virtue-based story, it enters into a distinct cognitive state. So when you're reading a compelling virtue-based story, then your brain goes into a particular cognitive state. And the reader's mental processes, emotions, and mental imagery become very concentrated on that narrative world when they're in that world. Okay, so they're essentially transported into that world, which then builds up their empathy. So when a leader, for example, when I speak to managers and leaders, I say when you read a story about a character from a completely foreign civilization, this kind of process takes place whereby you start to become affected by their way of thinking, and your brain starts to mirror their emotional state, because suddenly you are in a narrative, you've been narratively transported into the mind of someone else. And so then you start to think like them, you start to see like them. Okay. And so what this shows is that when leaders start to exhibit that kind of those behaviors, they start to become more pro-social. They start becoming much more social with people who are different, and it increases their empathy levels. So, so reading can do this. When you're reading about someone from a different, background, you can actually, improve that. And that breaks down barriers, because obviously today we're talking about a world without, borders. So it almost breaks down some of those borders and barriers that you have with people who are different. Because literally you're training your prefrontal cortex to look beyond cultural boundaries. Yeah. And that boosts empathy. And I think in a world that's full of AI tools and tech, I think those human skills, like being more empathetic, will hold you in very good stead. And of course, the way to develop your empathy is to read fiction, because that you get transported into those environments. Okay, I think that the last thing maybe I wanted to maybe just ask yourself, Dr. Willie, as well, as we're coming to this kind of last part of the program now, is today we live in a very obviously hyper-connected digital world, but physically and perhaps spiritually, many listeners of this show might be feeling a little bit trapped in front of their screens, in front of their that comfort zone that they're in. So if we want to kind of recapture that ancient kind of spirit, that ancient kind of borderless spirit of exploration, even while we're living in this physical world of restriction, what's the kind of mindset that we should take?
Well, I think you know this better than I do, Rehan, but I think a lot of people who've written these fictional novels and books and so forth, they weren't necessarily world travelers or had access to funds and means by which to go in many different places, but yet they had this imagination, and they had these perspectives where they could write about far off lands or things that don't even exist if they're writing like a fictional kind of futuristic novel. And someone like you mentioned Gene Roddenberry and others, Isaac Asimov, and what made them kind of conjure up this world. And so I think if I had to make an educated guess, I would say that they had a large modicum of presence where they were, right? And maybe they were very observant, and they can see subtle things. And even if even you're confined to a room, let's say, and nothing but the room, but there's a way you can look at what the room that you're in, and you can see a lot of things, right? And you can be observant about a lot of things. And I think today our level of distraction and what seems to be like kind of at our fingertips access to, I can put in the Google search and say, give me Bali or give me Tangiers, Morocco, and then I can see all the things about all the sites to see and all that thing. It's like, you've been there before you even go there. It kind of reminds me like when you watch a trailer for a movie and they put too much in the trailer. And it's like, I know the whole plot. Why am I going to go see that? Why am I going to sit through 2 hours when you're giving me everything in 5 minutes? So I think that's kind of, we're watching too many trailers, and we're not allowing ourselves to kind of be present in the moment. And we've talked about this, I think, often periodically throughout our podcast, the idea of presence, the idea of intention, The idea of you mentioned the safar al-qalb, or the travel of the heart, to be open to things, to do the simple things well, right? Even the way that we go and wash our hands, and the way that we take steps down to our kitchen and make our morning tea or our morning coffee. And these are all things that you can be quite present in, and they can be experienced unto themselves. But we just treat them as like, things to distract us until we find the next distraction that's going to be more distracting and more interesting. And then we have this kind of hyperness, I guess, for lack of a better word, about us, and we can't really have the stillness, I think, that's needed for deep thinking and observation. And what we mentioned earlier, this Quranic term, al-i'tibar, فَاعْتَبِرُوا يَا أُولِي الْأَبْصَارِ. The ones who have i'tibar, or consideration and observance, true spiritual observance, are the ones who have spiritual insight. And you won't get the spiritual insight unless you allow your heart to kind of take things in and have a stillness about it and be present with things and so forth. So I think that's is very important. It's something that I don't want to say the modern world robs us of that, but it's not easy to find that in kind of the current temporary climate that we have. But it's not impossible, and it's doable. And I think getting out of your comfort zone, going somewhere, even with your mind, with your imagination, that you haven't been before, I think is the first step towards that. So I think that's kind of where we would take it from. But turning back to your work with global organizations, I've worked many years ago. We keep talking about that, over 20 years. So, but you have these internal borders. You have departments, and I remember when I was part of the operations team, and then there was an engineering team. So the engineers would design, and the operations would find the faults in the design, because they're doing the day-to-day. And so there was always that inherent tension there. Who's to blame? The engineers who came up with the design, and we find a fault in it, or we didn't use it properly. And so back and forth all the time. So you have these kind of internal rivalries and silos and so forth, and that stifle collaboration. So if, however, an organization wants to capture that free-roaming spirit of exploration, mutual respect, shared virtue, so forth, then how must the stories they tell internally change, right? Instead of what I just described. How do you help a global workforce view themselves not as defenders of their specific department's borders, right? And you have that on all levels, even in government, I've seen that, but rather as co-explorers on a shared mission.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think this is definitely something anyone who's worked in an organization, particularly a large organization, you find that our organizations are siloed, departments, regional office, functional office, and they all end up treating information as like a state secret. Oh, don't tell those other guys in this other team. They're rivals. It's almost like an internal border warfare. And that internal border warfare almost completely destroys motivation. It destroys trust at an organizational level, right? There was one particular review done on organizational silos, and they found that silos essentially are a cultural and a behavioral act. Because what we do, so silos are a cultural and behavioral act. Because what we do is we reward, we introduce reward structures and metrics that are isolated to departments and employees. Just like a border patrol mindset, right? We're defending our turf, as part of the company's mission. And so to break those kind of borders down in an organization, I would say you almost need some kind of internal storytelling architecture. What I mean by that is you need stories that will bridge these networks, that will create cross-functional narratives, right? Rather than just, this is our stuff and we're going to defend our territory, but we're actually creating a cross-functional, narrative that speaks to everyone. So it's not just an executive team speaking to sales or R&D, but actually deploying a unified kind of purpose-driven narrative where every department sees themselves as a co-explorer on the same mission, right? We're all on the same mission, right? Rather than I'm just doing this is my KPI and I'm defending my castle and, don't come close, right? But actually, we're all going in the same way. So I think the more you can introduce that kind of collective kind of mindset through the use of storytelling, the more you can actually dissolve those internal borders. You can replace that competition and you can create that sense of mutual stewardship, I think is probably the right word, but which often is lacking, unfortunately, in many organizations as well. So I think that I think brings us to the end of today's show. We've been speaking about exploring without borders, and I think it's definitely been quite a fascinating discussion. I'd say I was a bit skeptical when you proposed the idea some weeks ago. I was like, what are we going to talk about? But actually, we've ended up having, I think, quite a energizing discussion. Hopefully, maybe it certainly shifted my view on a few things, and hopefully for the listeners as well. So, Dr. Walead, maybe if you have any last words, feel free to add, and maybe you can also give your book recommendation for this week as well.
Yeah, I think as a running theme that we've seen throughout our podcast, this journey in contemporary times or modernity, I think thinking out of the box and getting out of your comfort zone is maybe the main takeaway that I would for myself anyway, that would take out of this. And you don't know the possibilities until you actually try it. And we've so orchestrated and mediated our experiences, our future experiences, that is, to the degree that we have everything meticulously planned and down to the last note. And I think maybe to just take a chance and just, go take a walk out there, no particular destination, and see what the road brings you. I mean, people used to do that. That might be, one way to do it. And like I said, this was a whole genre in the Arabic Islamic literature. I think what's available in English largely is just Ibn Battuta, and so I'd recommend any of the translations of that. But there are actually other journeys that have been documented. One in particular that I came into contact with when I was writing my PhD had a very, very interesting name. The name of the book is رحلة الحقيقة والمجاز إلى الشام ومصر والحجاز. This was written by an 18th century, so quite late, a scholar by the name of Abd Al Ghani Al-Nabulusi from Damascus, Syria. And he called it the journey of Haqiqa, which is the ultimate reality, and Majaz, and the metaphorical reality, to the lands of Sham. And Sham here means Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, all of that is Sham, and Egypt, and the Hijaz, which is Mecca and Medina. So he documented his trip and the people he visited and the scholars he met and what they talked about and what was their mannerisms and so forth and all these different lands. And he actually gives you a glimpse into Beit al-Maqdis, into Jerusalem, and at that particular time back then, which is interesting. Unfortunately, it's only in Arabic, but I found that title and the contents of that book were fascinating. So people have access to the Arabic. I think the PDF is out there on the internet. So I'd recommend those two books in particular.
Great. Thank you so much for that recommendation. I think the book I would recommend is one I've mentioned on the show, which is The Moor's Account by Laila Lalami. Definitely a very good read. All right. Thank you to all our listeners for tuning in. And we look forward to welcoming you back on the next show. So peace be upon you and all the best from us.